In 1966, a group of Monsanto managers stood on the bank of Snow Creek, a narrow stream that ran behind their chemical plant on the west side of Anniston, Alabama. They had brought a bucket of fish, bluegills, bass, the kind of ordinary freshwater fish that children caught on lazy afternoons in exactly this creek. They lowered the fish into the water. Within 10 seconds, the fish turned belly up. They were spurting blood, shedding their skin in sheets, dying as if they had been dropped into a pot on a stove. 10 seconds. The managers watched. They noted the result. Then they went back inside, and they told no one. That creek, Snow Creek, ran through the backyards of a neighborhood. Kids waded in it during the summer. Families fished from it and fried what they caught for dinner. A few blocks downstream, the water merged with drainage ditches that fed to gardens where people grew their greens and sweet potatoes, the yards where they raised hogs, the dirt their children played in. Anniston sat at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains, and on the west side of town, the poor side, the black side, people had a tradition of eating the local red clay. They called it Alabama clay, and they cooked it for extra flavor. Nobody knew the clay was saturated with chemicals. Nobody knew the creek was toxic. Nobody knew because the people who did know had decided it was better for business if they didn't. To understand how a thing like that happens, how a company watches fish die in 10 seconds and simply walks away, you have to understand what kind of place Anniston was and how it came to be. Because Anniston wasn't just any American city. It was, by design and by reputation, one of the most carefully planned communities in the history of the country. They called it the Model City. And the very thing that made it a model, total corporate control, a belief that the company knew best, a culture of keeping outsiders in the dark, was the same thing that eventually poisoned it. The story begins in 1872 in a clearing in the Alabama woods, with two men who had no business meeting each other. Samuel Noble was an English-born iron master who had grown up in Reading, Pennsylvania, learning the trade in his father's foundry. He'd made his way south after the Civil War, buying up mineral-rich land in northeast Alabama. Daniel Tyler was a former Union general from Connecticut and, improbably, a cousin of Aaron Burr. Noble was looking for investors. Tyler had money and an engineer's mind. They met in a Charleston, South Carolina railroad office and shook hands on a partnership that would build a company and a city from scratch. By April 1873, their Woodstock Iron Company had fired up a 40-ton blast furnace in Calhoun County, Alabama. Furnace number 1, set on 2,000 acres of hilly woodland at the foot of Blue Mountain. The iron that poured from it was some of the finest car wheel iron in the country, strong enough and pure enough to find buyers in the industrial North even during the panic of 1873, when businesses across America were folding. The steady demand for that iron kept Woodstock afloat through the depression of the 1870s while competitors vanished. By 1879, they built furnace number 2. By 1880, they enlarged number 1. Noble named the little settlement that grew around the furnaces after Tyler's wife, Annie. Annie's town. Anniston. But Noble didn't want a town. He wanted a utopia. He laid out streets in a perfect checkerboard grid, wide and tree-lined, with oaks planted along what he called Noble Street. He designed worker cottages, 4 rooms each, set on quarter-acre lots with space for vegetable gardens and flower beds, and called them homes, not hives. He put in parks with rolling bluegrass and evergreens, built a company store, erected churches and schools. He started a newspaper and named it The Hot Blast, after the roar of the furnaces. And then he did something almost unheard of for a company town. He built a fence around the whole thing. A physical fence around the city's perimeter with a closed-door policy that kept outsiders from entering without permission. Anniston was, in effect, one of America's earliest gated communities, a private corporate fiefdom where the company decided who got in, what got built, and how life was lived. The control was remarkable, and so was the result. By 1882, Anniston became the first city in Alabama to be lit by electricity. By 1884, it had telephone service. In 1885, Noble opened the Anniston Inn, a grand hotel designed to attract visitors and investors, a place where the guest list would eventually include vaudeville stars and celebrities. Henry Grady, the famous editor of the Atlanta Constitution and the loudest voice calling for a new South built on industry rather than cotton, visited Anniston and was dazzled. He called it the Model City and pointed to Noble's ironworks as the future of the region. Samuel Noble had built exactly what he set out to build, a perfect little world, scrubbed clean and running on schedule, where the company knew best and everyone else was grateful. On July 3, 1883, the Woodstock Iron Company finally opened Anniston to the public. The fence came down, the closed-door policy ended, and people flooded in. By 1890, the population had reached nearly 10,000. Cotton textile mills arrived in 1881, employing the wives and children of the iron workers. The Alabama Pipe Company opened and began manufacturing cast iron sewer pipe. By the 1940s, it would produce roughly 22% of all the cast iron pipe in the country. A second blast furnace fired up in 1879, then enlargements and expansions, one after another. Noble Street filled with three-story brick commercial buildings, the Caldwell Building in 1889, the Bank of Anniston in 1888, the Federal Courthouse in 1904. Solid Victorian structures, built by men who assumed they'd last centuries. Some of them still stand. What didn't last was Samuel Noble. He died in 1888, just 5 years after opening his city to the world. He was 53 years old. But the machinery he'd set in motion kept running. The model city had its own momentum now. New industries arrived. A cotton textile mill in 1881 that employed the wives and children of iron workers. Then more foundries, then pipe works. In 1887, Woodstock Iron reorganized to include the Anniston Pipe Works. The Alabama Pipe Company would become a powerhouse, manufacturing cast iron sewer pipe for cities across the country. By the 1940s, it would produce roughly 22% of all the cast iron pipe made in America. That's a staggering market share for a single plant in a small Alabama city. And it meant that the infrastructure beneath American streets, the pipes carrying water and sewage in towns from coast to coast, was being forged in Anniston. The military discovered the city during the Spanish-American War, establishing Camp Ship in 1898, when nearly 10,000 troops arrived to train before deploying to Cuba. The camp closed within months, but the Army remembered Anniston's rail connections, its mountain terrain, its climate. In 1917, as the United States entered World War I, the government purchased nearly 19,000 acres for $247,000 and built Camp McClellan. 20,000 soldiers at a time trained in those Appalachian foothills. World War I also brought something else to Anniston, heavy chemical production. The Anniston Ordnance Company and the Anniston Steel Company churned out artillery shells. A young industrialist from Tennessee named Theodore Swan arrived to manage steel production and saw an opportunity that would transform the city, though not in the way anyone imagined. The camp would be renamed Fort McClellan in 1929 at the urging of Anniston Star publisher Harry Mellairs and was given permanent status. It became one of the largest Army installations in the country, training an estimated 500,000 troops during World War II alone. The government poured $6.5 million into expanding it. 47 miles of new roads, sewage facilities, an 80-building hospital, housing for thousands. On the other side of town, the Anniston Army Depot opened in 1941 on more than 10,000 acres, storing ammunition in 500 concrete igloos built into the hillside, managed for a time by the Chrysler Corporation. During the war, millions of dollars in federal contracts flowed into Anniston's foundries and mills. Artillery shells, cartridge cases, steel alloys, everything an army needed. By the 1940s, Anniston was a place where everything seemed to converge. Iron and pipe and textiles and the military, all pulling in the same direction. The population hit 25,523 in 1940. It jumped to 31,150 by 1950. It would peak at 33,320 in 1960, making Anniston the fifth largest city in Alabama. Downtown Noble Street hummed with shops and restaurants. The Alabama Hotel, at the corner of 12th and Noble, housed the Chamber of Commerce, a jewelry store, a barber shop, a beauty parlor, and a Southern Railway ticket office before it burned spectacularly on September 15, 1944, claiming at least one life. The Manhattan Hotel, later called the Heart of Anniston Inn, opened at 1301 Noble Street in 1917, a three-story brick building with a lobby that still had its original wood front desk and room key slots decades later. Anniston was a city with weight to it. Heavy industry, heavy architecture, heavy payrolls. But here is the fact that changes everything, the detail that has to be planted early because its full meaning won't arrive for decades. That same Theodore Swan, the industrialist who had come to Anniston during the First World War to manage steel production, had gone on to build a chemical empire. In the early 1920s, he gave his engineers a challenge. Find a way to mass-produce polychlorinated biphenyls, a class of synthetic chemicals that had been known since the 1880s but were expensive and difficult to make. His engineers succeeded. By 1929, Swan's Chemical Company had opened a plant on the west side of Anniston that became the first facility in the nation to manufacture PCBs on an industrial scale. PCBs were, at the time, a wonder product. They were non-flammable, chemically stable, resistant to heat and electrical conductivity, and excellent at insulating the transformers, capacitors, and hydraulic systems that powered America's growing electrical grid. They were used in everything from carbonless copy paper to fluorescent light ballasts to heat transfer fluids. Every power company in the country needed them. Every manufacturer of electrical equipment bought them. PCBs were the invisible lubricant of the modern electrical age, and almost all of them came from one place. Swan was a showman, the kind of man who hosted the 1930 Alabama Crimson Tide football team in private Pullman cars on their way to the Rose Bowl, and threw a victory banquet in his Red Mountain Castle when they beat Washington State. He built a wine cellar designed to resemble a cave, reassembled an actual English pub in his basement, and lived on a scale that matched his ambitions. But by the early 1930s, the Depression had caught up with him. He had been forced to sell shares to investors, couldn't keep up with loan payments, and found himself outmaneuvered. In 1935, Edgar Queeny of Monsanto, the St. Louis chemical giant, forced Swan out of his own company in a complex financial arrangement involving straw companies and New York creditors. Swan walked away with a $1 million buyout. Monsanto walked away with full control of the Anniston plant and a monopoly on PCB production in the United States that would last for decades. One historian later wrote that the spirit of Swan Chemical became the corporate culture of Monsanto. The plant had about 1,000 employees. It sat just west of town, with Snow Creek running beside it and through the neighborhoods below. What happened next took place in slow motion, over decades, in the background of everything else that made Anniston a thriving mid-century American city. While soldiers trained at Fort McClellan and pipe rolled off the production line, and Noble Street's shops sold clothes and jewelry to a growing population, the Monsanto plant was quietly discharging tens of thousands of pounds of PCBs into Snow Creek every year, an estimated 50,000 pounds annually through the creek alone, and dumping millions of pounds of PCB-laced waste into unlined, open-pit landfills that oozed and seeped into the surrounding soil and groundwater. The landfills were antiquated even by the standards of the time, nothing more than holes in the ground where toxic sludge was poured and left to spread. The waste had a faintly acrid smell, But PCBs themselves are colorless and nearly odorless. You couldn't see them in the water. You couldn't see them in the dirt. You certainly couldn't see them in the fish, the hogs, the vegetables, the clay. On the west side of Anniston, people lived the way poor, rural black families in Alabama had lived for generations. Jeremiah Smith, who would later become a plaintiff in the lawsuits, raised hogs in his backyard, grew potatoes and greens, kept rabbits and a cow. We were poor people, he said. We had to raise food ourselves. We were trying to survive and live. His neighbors did the same. Children ran barefoot through the yards and played in the creeks. Families gathered at churches like Mars Hill Missionary Baptist, a congregation that had anchored the community for generations. Nobody knew that the soil beneath the sweet potatoes, the water in the ditches, the flesh of the fish they fried for supper, were all laced with chemicals that the company next door had been dumping since before most of them were born. Some employees began to suspect something was wrong as early as the 1950s, but management did nothing in response. The company had its own doctors, its own labs, its own internal information networks, and a deep institutional commitment to protecting its monopoly. Monsanto was the sole producer of PCBs in the United States, and the product was generating $22 million a year in sales. That was the revenue that mattered. Snow Creek was just a creek. Then came 1966 and the fish test that opens this story. The managers who watched bluegills hemorrhage and die in 10 seconds didn't issue a warning, didn't contact the health department, didn't knock on the doors of the families who lived along that creek. They filed an internal report. The company did take steps to reduce mercury releases into Snow Creek after the fish kills, mercury being another pollutant the plant was generating. But it made no effort to reduce PCB discharges. The Anniston plant was leaking 50,000 pounds of PCBs into Snow Creek every year, while dumping more than 1 million pounds of PCB-laced waste into its landfills. For context, the Environmental Protection Agency would later order General Electric to spend $460 million to dredge 150,000 pounds of PCBs from the Hudson River in New York. The Anniston plant was releasing multiples of that every single year, and nobody outside the company knew. The following year, in early 1967, a group of Swedish scientists made headlines by demonstrating that PCBs were showing up throughout the global food chain, in fish, in birds, in pine needles, even in children's hair. The Swedes proved that PCBs were persistent, a word that, as one lawyer would later remark, is nothing but a fancy way of saying they won't go away. The research was alarming, and it generated international media attention. Monsanto's primary response was to prepare for a media war. One internal memo urged colleagues to act quickly so that our Aerochlor business is not affected by this evil publicity. Aerochlor was Monsanto's trade name for its PCBs. The first thing Monsanto's board of directors did in November 1967 was approve a $2.9 million expansion of Aerochlor production at Anniston and at its other plant in Sauget, Illinois. The vote was unanimous. In 1969, company tests found fish in another creek near the plant carrying PCB levels 7,500 times above legal limits. Internal memos record the conclusion, there was little object in going to expensive extremes in limiting discharges. That same year, in September, Monsanto appointed what it called the Aerochlor's Ad Hoc Committee to address the mounting controversies around its PCB monopoly. The minutes of the committee's first meeting are among the most damning corporate documents ever put on paper. The committee had only two formal objectives. The first, permit continued sales and profits. The second, protect image of the corporation. Another internal memo was blunter. We can't afford to lose $1 of business. The committee acknowledged privately that the situation was dire. PCBs were turning up across the country, in fish, in oysters, in bald eagles, in milk, in Georgia and Maryland. They had been implicated in a mass shrimp die-off in Florida. Members of Congress were calling for hearings. The committee warned in its own minutes that regulators noticing the contamination around the Anniston plant would shut us down, depending on what plants or animals they choose to find harmed. Their solution was not to stop producing PCBs, but to develop alternatives so they could phase out PCBs gradually, maintaining one of Monsanto's most profitable franchises for as long as possible while reducing liability. By May 1970, PCBs were all over the national media. Monsanto made a calculated decision. Rather than wait for regulators to discover what was pouring out of their Anniston plant, they would disclose the contamination themselves, but only to one person. They informed Joe Crockett, the technical director of the Alabama Water Improvement Commission, that PCBs were entering Snow Creek. Crockett, according to Monsanto's own memo, had been totally unaware of published information concerning aerochlors. The Monsanto executives assured him everything was under control. Crockett said he appreciated their candor and offered his own guidance. Give no statements or publications which would bring the situation to the public's attention. The state regulator, in other words, helped the company keep its secret. Around this same time, a Monsanto progress report tested the source of Anniston's drinking water supply for PCBs. The sample came back clean. The report's author noted, with a dark precision that reads like gallows humor, that this was the only sample collected to date which does not contain aerochlors. Everything else, the creeks, the soil, the drainage ditches, the landfills, was contaminated. Monsanto ceased PCB production at its Anniston plant in 1971, a few years before the federal government banned PCBs entirely in 1979. It continued production at its other plant in Sauget, Illinois, until the ban took effect. But ceasing production is not the same as cleaning up what you've already done. The PCBs were in the ground, in the water, in the food chain. They don't break down. They bioaccumulate, concentrating as they move up through organisms, from soil to worm to chicken to person. A fish in Snow Creek might have PCB levels hundreds of times higher than the water around it. A person who ate that fish week after week, year after year, accumulated those chemicals in their fat tissue, their blood, their organs. And on the west side of Anniston, people had been eating those fish, breathing that air, and gardening in that soil for 4 decades. Meanwhile, the city that Samuel Noble had built as a model was beginning to crack for other reasons entirely. In the 1970s, the cast iron pipe industry collapsed as plastic piping took over the market. Foreign competition squeezed what was left of the heavy metal sector. The textile mills that had employed wives and daughters were bleeding jobs. By 1993, unemployment in Anniston had climbed above 17%, nearly double the already high rate for Calhoun County. And then came the final blow. In 1995, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission voted to shut down Fort McClellan, the fort that had sustained Anniston through 2 world wars, the installation that at its peak had housed 10,000 military personnel and employed 1,500 civilians, that had pumped an estimated $600 million a year into the local economy, gone. The official closing ceremony was held on May 20th, 1999. The Army spent $231 million to dismantle the base. Anniston was left with 18,000 acres of empty land and the kind of silence that follows an era. It was in the middle of this slow-motion collapse that the truth about PCBs finally surfaced, and it started with something almost absurd in its simplicity. In 1993, a fisherman pulled a severely deformed largemouth bass from Chocolaco Creek, downstream from Snow Creek. The fish was grotesque, misshapen, visibly wrong in ways that no natural variation could explain. The catch set off a chain of inquiries, media coverage, and environmental testing that for the first time forced the public to ask what had been flowing through those waterways for decades. In 1985, state-led investigations had already found PCB-tainted soils around Snow Creek, but the discovery had been handled with a peculiar lack of urgency. A dispute over cleanup had dragged on for years. Monsanto had proposed dredging just a few hundred yards of creek, a token gesture in a contamination zone that extended for miles. And in 1988, a new Attorney General named Donald Siegelman had received a friendly letter from Monsanto's Anniston superintendent, thanking him for meeting the company's lobbyists and speaking to their trade association. Monsanto got state approval for its limited plan. A state official would later concede, "It's hard to know how that one slipped through the cracks." For some reason, no one investigated the larger PCB problem. Then, in late 1995, something happened that broke the silence completely. A Monsanto manager approached the congregation of Mars Hill Missionary Baptist Church, a small black church on the west side of Anniston, with an offer to buy their sanctuary for a substantial sum, $2.5 million plus a church van, in exchange for the congregation relocating to a new site. The deal looked like a generous real estate transaction, until the congregation learned the real reason Monsanto wanted the property. The church grounds were so saturated with PCBs that the building would have to be demolished for any meaningful cleanup to proceed. The company wasn't buying a church. It was buying a contaminated site. And the contamination, residents began to realize, wasn't limited to one church lot. It was everywhere, in their yards, their gardens, their water, their blood. The revelation cracked open years of unexplained illness, the cancers, the learning disabilities, the asthma, the reproductive problems, the skin conditions, all the things that families on the west side of Anniston had lived with for decades, never connecting them to a cause, suddenly had a name. In 1996, Mars Hill Missionary Baptist Church and more than 3,000 residents filed suit against Monsanto. Monsanto had by then already begun maneuvering to distance itself from liability. In 1997, the company spun off its chemical division into a new entity called Solutia, Inc., a corporate maneuver that placed the PCB legacy in a separate legal box. More lawsuits followed. By the early 2000s, roughly 20,000 current and former residents had joined 5 different lawsuits against Monsanto, Solutia, and their corporate affiliates. Discovery proceedings unearthed thousands of pages of internal Monsanto documents, many of them stamped with a phrase that would become notorious: confidential, read and destroy. The scope of what the documents revealed was staggering. Here was a company that had, in response to a 1994 Sierra magazine article about PCBs, publicly declared that Monsanto has never concealed any hazard of PCBs, and that claims of cover-ups were untrue and out of touch with Monsanto's way of doing business. The internal files told an entirely different story. These weren't ambiguous memos. They were records of a company that had systematically documented its own contamination, studied the health effects, understood the scope of the disaster, and then buried the evidence. The 1966 fish test, the 1969 committee minutes, the 1975 study that found PCBs caused tumors in laboratory rats, a study whose managers ordered the conclusion changed from slightly tumorigenic to does not appear to be carcinogenic. The altered language was a lie, and the lie had been deliberate. On January 1st, 2002, the Washington Post published a front-page investigation by reporter Michael Grunwald under the headline, "Monsanto Hid Decades of Pollution." The subhead read, "PCBs drenched Alabama town, but no one was ever told." The article laid out the paper trail in devastating detail. The Birmingham News editorialized that there's not a spin doctor alive who could hide the truth about Monsanto's wanton poisoning of the water and land in West Anniston. The trial of Owens versus Monsanto began in April 2001 in Alabama Circuit Court. Monsanto's defense was audacious. Their lead attorney told the courtroom that PCBs posed only one known health risk, a treatable skin condition called chloracne. The truth is that PCBs are everywhere, he said. They are in meat, they are in everyone in the courtroom. It was a remarkable argument that because a toxic substance had become ubiquitous, its manufacturer bore no special responsibility for dumping millions of pounds of it into one community. David Carpenter, an environmental health professor at the State University of New York at Albany, testified as an expert witness for the plaintiffs. He had spent years studying PCB contamination along the Hudson River in New York, where General Electric had been ordered to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on cleanup. Carpenter said the situation in Anniston was worse. "I'm looking out my window at the Hudson right now," he told reporters, "but the reality is that the people who live around the Monsanto plant have higher PCB levels than any residential population I've ever seen. They're 10 times higher than the people around the Hudson." In 2003, an Alabama jury found that Monsanto had polluted Anniston and should be held liable. Monsanto, Solutia, and Pharmacia, the pharmaceutical company that had merged with Monsanto in 2000, agreed to pay roughly $700 million to more than 20,000 current and former residents. Of that, $600 million was designated for personal injury claims, with an additional $100 million earmarked for cleanup and community programs. Solutia declared bankruptcy that same year. Monsanto continued to insist through various corporate restructurings that it was no longer the same entity responsible for Anniston's contamination. The settlement sounds like a large number, and it is, but divided among 20,000 people, it comes to roughly $35,000 per person. Compensation for decades of exposure to a probable carcinogen, for the cancers and the learning disabilities and the diabetes that subsequent research would link to PCBs, for the destruction of property values in neighborhoods where homes that had once been worth something became essentially unsellable, for the loss of a community where people had lived for generations, for the fact that their children had been playing in poison and nobody told them. Some families, after legal fees, received less than they would have needed to move. Monsanto also purchased and demolished approximately 100 homes on the west side of Anniston that were so heavily contaminated with PCBs that no one could live in them. The EPA designated the area a Superfund site. Cleanup would stretch across decades and is, in many respects, ongoing. Men in hazmat suits, residents called them moon suits, spent weeks excavating tainted soil from yards and churchyards and empty lots. A new landfill was built to hold the contaminated earth removed from the neighborhood. Boarded-up houses with sunken porches and red nuisance signs began to outnumber occupied homes on some blocks. Stray dogs wandered streets that had once been full of families. The Reverend Thomas Long, who had lived on Montrose Avenue for years, looked around one day and realized he had no neighbors left. A 2016 health study found that while PCB levels in Anniston residents had dropped slightly between 2007 and 2014, they remained far above those of the general population. Researchers also established a connection between PCB exposure and elevated rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, and chronic liver inflammation. The chemicals that Monsanto dumped into Snow Creek and its landfills more than half a century ago are still measurable in the blood of people who live in the area today. PCBs are persistent. They won't go away. Anniston's population in the 2020 census was 21,564. That's a 35% decline from the 1960 peak of 33,320. The city is roughly half black and half white. The poverty rate sits around 21%. The child poverty rate is above 43%. The Anniston Army Depot remains the city's largest employer, with approximately 3,500 workers. Fort McClellan's 18,000 acres have been slowly repurposed. A wildlife refuge here, an industrial park there, a concert venue in the old horse stables. Noble Street still has its late 19th century brick facades, and some of them have been restored. The Peerless Saloon, said to be Alabama's oldest operating bar, is still open. The Anniston Star, which began life as the Hot Blast in 1883, still publishes, now owned by the Ayres family, descendants of the physician who bought the paper in the 1890s. But on the west side of town, behind the old Monsanto property, now owned by Eastman Chemical Company, which acquired Solutia, the landscape tells a different story. The creeks are posted with fish consumption advisories. The EPA's cleanup is organized into multiple operable units covering soil, sediment, surface water, groundwater, and air across Anniston, Oxford, Hobson City, and parts of 2 counties. Chocolaco Creek, the waterway where that deformed bass was pulled in 1993, carries a no-consumption advisory for all fish. Snow Creek, the little stream where bluegills bled out in 10 seconds in 1966, is being remediated yard by yard, block by block, in a process that will likely continue for years. There is one more piece of this story that deserves mention because it reveals something about the kind of city Anniston was and the kinds of silence it could produce. On May 14, 1961, a Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders arrived at the Anniston bus station. A mob of 50 white men, led by a Ku Klux Klan leader named William Chappell, attacked the bus with pipes, chains, and bats, slashing its tires and smashing its windows. Local police had been warned hours earlier, but didn't arrive until after the assault began. When the bus limped out of town on its damaged tires, the mob followed. 6 miles outside Anniston, on Highway 202, the tires finally gave out. Someone threw a firebomb through a broken window. Others tried to barricade the door, trapping the riders inside the burning bus. The fuel tank exploded. The riders escaped through the windows and were beaten again on the ground. The photograph of that burning Greyhound, the company logo just barely visible through the smoke, became one of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement. That was 1961, 5 years before the fish test on Snow Creek. The same city, the same culture of silence, the same willingness to look away, the same conviction that certain people's lives were not worth the cost of doing the right thing. The Freedom Riders were beaten in broad daylight while police waited. The PCBs flowed for decades while a company watched and a state regulator advised discretion. Different kinds of poison, the same indifference to who gets hurt. Samuel Noble built his model city with a fence around it. The fence was supposed to keep the wrong people out and make sure the right people were in charge. It worked for a while. Anniston grew and prospered behind that fence. The broad avenues, the fine iron, the oak trees on Noble Street, the inn where celebrities signed the guest book. Then the fence came down in 1883, and the city opened itself to the world, and for 70 or 80 years it looked like the model had succeeded. 5-story hotels, a military base, 33,000 people, the 5th largest city in Alabama. But the old habit, the belief that the company knows best, that certain information is better kept inside, never really went away. It just found a new host. And for 4 decades, behind the closed doors of a chemical plant on the west side of town, that habit did what it had always done. It protected the people in charge and left everyone else in the dark. Snow Creek kept running, the children kept playing, the gardens kept growing, and the documents, stamped "Confidential, Read and Destroy," kept piling up in filing cabinets that nobody outside was ever meant to open. Today, on the bank of Snow Creek, where Monsanto managers once watched fish die in 10 seconds, there is dirt. It may or may not have been remediated. It may or may not still contain measurable levels of PCBs. There is a fence there, too, a chain-link one put up by the EPA. It is doing the same thing that Samuel Noble's fence did 150 years ago. It is telling people to stay out for their own good, because the people in charge have decided what's safe and what isn't. Whether you trust the people behind the fence is, in Anniston, a question with a very long answer.